This week, and as we've made mention several times today, we got a lot of people going to be traveling over the next week, so continue to pray for each other as we'll be in and out pretty well all week long. About the time one group gets back, the other group's going to be heading out, so be sure to be praying for each other during travels and stuff this week. Excited that Brother Philip is going to get to go preach over in Kentucky. Be sure to be praying for those services and pray for Brother Philip as he preaches there. Of course, we've made mention of different families that we are in contact with that are got health problems and different struggles and troubles, and you know all the names, so be sure to be praying for each of them. Pray for the mission work here, that we would know what the Lord wants for us, next steps, things that we need to be doing. Of course, the kids had collected up a little bit of money over a period of time. We've got that we need to do something with, and they've given some good ideas on ways that we can use those funds to help others, to bring glory to the Lord. So be praying about those things as well, right? All right. We are going to be back in the book of Psalms. Back in the book of Psalms. We're going to start there anyways. We will end up in a few other places. But we're going to be in Psalms chapter 64. Psalms chapter 64. The superscription above this says that it is a psalm of David. And the psalm reads like this. Hear my voice, O God, in my prayer. He starts sometimes like that, right? Hear my voice, O God, in my prayer. Preserve my life from fear of the enemy. Hide me from the secret counsel of the wicked, from the insurrection of the workers of iniquity, who whet their tongue like a sword and bend their bow to shoot their arrows, even bitter words, that they may shoot in secret at the perfect. Suddenly do they shoot at him and fear not. They encourage themselves in all evil matter. They commune of laying snares privately, and they say, who shall see them? They search out iniquities. They accomplish a diligent search. Both the inward thought of every one of them and the heart is deep. But God shall shoot at them with an arrow. Suddenly shall they be wounded. So they shall make their own tongue to fall upon themselves. All that see them shall flee away, and all men shall fear and shall declare the work of God, for they shall wisely consider of his doing. The righteous shall be glad in the Lord and shall trust in him, and all the upright in heart shall glory. Now in this psalm, he starts, of course, as he has several of the prior ones, where he says, hear my voice, O God, right? He pleads with the Lord to hear him as he prays. And his plea is that he would be preserved from fear of the enemy. That his life would be preserved from the fear of the enemy. And then he goes on, really, in verse 2, to say, hide me from the secret counsel of the wicked and from the insurrection of the workers' iniquity. So his prayer here in these first two verses is that the Lord would preserve his life from the fear of the enemy, that the Lord would hide him from the secret counsel of the wicked, and that the Lord would keep him from the insurrection of the workers of iniquity. Now, the psalmist here is aware of the idea that there are wicked people out there in this world who are out to get the people of God, the children of God, right? They are out to destroy them. He also is aware of the idea that they aren't always apparent. They're not always obvious. Matter of fact, he says, hide me from the secret counsel of the wicked. You get the idea there that there are those that have secretly collaborated together and they are planning how they can destroy or how they can conquer or how they can undermine the psalmist here. And sometimes he's aware of it, and sometimes he's not. But his prayer is the Lord would protect him even from the things that he can't see. Lord, hide me from the secret counsel of the wicked and from the insurrection of the workers of iniquity. That idea there, insurrection, is, when you look it up in the Strongs, it's this idea of like a tumultuous crowd. So, protect me or hide me from the secret counsel of the wicked, and hide me and protect me from the tumultuous crowd of the workers of iniquity, right? The loud and boisterous and in your face, and the secret counsel that is out to try to sneak up on you. Lord, protect me from them, right? We know where our protection comes from, right? Hey, we need to have our eyes open. We need to be looking around us. We need to be doing the things of the Lord. But we are not going to be able to see and be aware of everything that's coming our way. And honestly, some of the things we can see coming our way, we are kind of powerless to stop. Doesn't matter which one it is. We need to be trusting in the Lord to keep us, to protect us, and to hide us, and to preserve us from those things. Now, as he continues to go, he really starts to describe some of these enemies, right? He already has a little bit. He talks about the fear that they create. He talks about the secret counsels. He talks about the loud, tumultuous groups. But then he starts to describe them in verse 3. He says, who whet their tongue like a sword and bend their bow to shoot their arrows, even bitter words. You know, sometimes our enemies come at us with actual weapons, but oftentimes the people of God are actually confronted with weapons of words, right? Slander and the things they claim about us or the things that they say about us. Whatever, right? The psalmist here is describing that sometimes people come at you with their tongue and they use it as a weapon. Now here in this, I think you also see some premeditation. Who whet their tongue like a sword. Now, I don't know what the rest of you imagine, especially you younger ones, when I say you whet your sword. Like, I don't know what you're picturing there. But imagine, if you would, them sharpening their sword, okay? You know, a sword, it's a heavy chunk of metal, right? But you know, there's a difference between something that's like a letter opener. It looks like a knife, doesn't it? And it can cut through some paper. But a letter opener can only do so much. So imagine the difference between a letter opener and a dagger, right? Well, you know, a dagger, after a lot of use, can kind of become like a letter opener. It becomes dull, and it doesn't accomplish as much as it should as a weapon. So what people do that take care of their weapons is they sharpen them, and they use a special stone. And lots of times on these stones, you're going to take an oil or you're going to take some kind of substance and you rub it on that stone. And then you take that stone and you hold the blade a certain way and you sharpen the edges of that. And what you're doing is you're actually grinding off little bits of the metal to shape that into a really sharp edge. Because listen, that thing is going to work as a weapon so much better when it's sharp. Hey, listen, a dull weapon can hurt, but a sharp weapon can slice and slice quickly. It takes much less effort on the person's part that's using it. And so the picture that he's trying to draw here is that the wicked, especially like these that he talked about, who they take secret counsel, right? Man, they are like plotting and planning, and they are sharpening those words. What can I say? How can I say it? What's the best way to say it? How can I say this in a way that maybe I'm giving a grain of truth, but I'm lying at the same time, and I'm going to cause the most amount of damage that I can? you kind of get this idea of somebody that's doing that, right? They're honing their words to the fine, sharp point where it's going to cause the most damage it possibly can. They whet their tongue like a sword, and they bend their bow to shoot their arrows, even bitter words. Bitter words. And he said it's like these words are like a sharpened sword or a bent bow, right? If I have a bow bent like this, what do you think I plan on doing with it? Well, this guy in the front row keeps moving every time that I do this. I think he gets the idea of what I'm going to do with that thing, doesn't he? Man, the further I pull that back and the more tension on that thing, when I let go of that, it's going to do some damage. And he says these wicked people that are workers of iniquity, they whet their tongues like a sword and they bend their bows to shoot their arrows, even bitter words. Verse 4, that they may shoot in secret at the perfect. Now, if you think about this, we're going to continue this little thing that we did here, right? As I draw my bow, well, he's trying to get away from it, right? Because he sees me. But the picture that you actually get here is that the worker of iniquity is hidden. You don't even know that the arrow's pointed at you. Now, think back on what he prayed earlier. Lord, hide me from the secret counsel of the wicked, right? Listen, they have drawn their bow back. They have got these bitter words ready to strike. And their intent in verse 4 is ambush, that they may shoot in secret at the perfect. Suddenly do they shoot at him and fear not. The idea there in that verse is that they are shooting from ambush. They have secretly plotted and planned. They've sharpened their words. They've got it laid out just right. And they're hidden behind a bush or a tree or a ledge. And they've got that thing drew back. And when you step in, right? In verse 5, it says, they encourage themselves in evil matter. They encourage themselves in this. I don't know. I almost got this picture of a group of guys and they're kind of plotting and planning, and maybe some of them are starting to think, I don't know, maybe we shouldn't do this, or maybe we're not going to get away with it. It's going to be fine. Let's do it. Come on. Man, we can do this. We're going to do this. Right? They're encouraged. They're uplifted by what they're planning, by what they're doing. These are wicked men. It says in the last half of verse 5, they commune of laying snares privately. Again, this picture is they are plotting and planning, and they are counting and keeping track of the traps that they have laid. And these are traps. You ever seen the movies where the people have to walk through a minefield? Hey, you can't see it, right? All you know is that as you walk across this field, at any moment, you could step on something that's going to blow up. Well, the picture drawn here is that these guys have plotted and planned, and they've encouraged each other to the point where they have laid traps privately, hidden, stowed away, ready to go, just waiting for somebody to step on it. And they say, who shall see them? We're going to get away with this. We've laid them out. We know where they're at. We've put them down. We've laid these traps. We've laid these pits. And nobody's going to see them. To some degree, I think there's two thoughts in that, who shall see them. There's the thought of, we've laid them out perfectly, and they are going to work, and they are going to trap people because they can't see it. There's also the idea of, we're going to get away with it. It says in verse 6, they search out iniquities. Hey, you know what? There are people that go about their life looking for trouble, looking for wickedness, looking for the things that they can do. They search out iniquities. And the Bible says they're successful. It says they accomplish a diligent search. You know, sometimes people get the impression that people that are wicked are lazy. They're often not. Man, they work hard at what they do. I think about, of course, we work in a company that is all about software and technology, right? And in the course of that, we sometimes run across situations like with hackers or people that are trying to scam other people and things like that. I am amazed at how hard these people work at this. Like I think if they would just apply the work and the effort and the things they do to something good, they could probably make a lot of money. They could probably have a pretty decent living. But you know what? They diligently search for iniquities, and they find it. Hey, listen, you don't have to try actually that hard to find iniquities. But these people are described as they search them out, and they accomplish a diligent search. The last half of verse 6 says, both the inward thought of every one of them and the heart is deep. Listen, these are not shallow, dumb people. These are people that are putting a lot of effort into this. They're putting a lot of thought into this. But listen, their heart is committed to it. They think about it, they dwell on it, they meditate on it. And then in the last parts of this chapter, he describes God's actions toward those people. He says in verse 7, but God shall shoot at them with an arrow. Suddenly shall they be wounded. I don't know about you, but I have this picture in my mind of this guy with his arrow drawn back, right? And he's in hiding, right? So you can't see him. You don't know that arrow's pointed at you, and he's about ready to let it go. He's just waiting for you to step around the corner. And then God intervenes, and God lets loose his arrow. And it finds its mark. And those who said, we've laid our traps, we've set them out privately, who shall see us? Who shall see them? Suddenly they find God's judgment coming down on them. It says, suddenly shall they be wounded. In verse 8, so they shall make their own tongue to fall upon themselves. All that see them shall flee away. Verse 8, by the way, I believe is coming back up to verse 3 when it talks about how they're whetting their tongues like a sword, right? And they're getting ready to bend their bows. But when God intervenes, that tongue that they've sharpened, that plan that they've laid, that trap that they've set, actually springs on them. In other words, God turns the tables on them. There's verses that talk about the guy that digs the pit is going to fall into it himself. It's the same principle that you're seeing here in this psalm. They've made all these plans. They've set up all these traps. They know where they are. They don't think anybody else is going to see them. But when God intervenes, God uses their own words against them. He uses their own traps against them. And they find themselves under judgment. It says that all that see them shall flee away. And then in verse 9, and all men shall fear and shall declare the work of God, for they shall wisely consider of his doing. Because when it happens, and these wicked people fall into this trap, this plotting and planning and conniving and everything, it's revealed what they had planned and what they were going to do, and people see it, and they see how that it should have worked, and yet God intervened, and people actually, they flee from the wicked, but they also see the power of God. And some people actually turn to him when they see him work in the life of a righteous person by overcoming the wicked. It says that they shall wisely consider of his doing. I think about guys like Nebuchadnezzar, right? As he was about to throw, or did throw, I should say, the three Hebrew, we say children, three Hebrew men into the fire, the burning fiery furnace, right? Man, when they came out, he was faced with having to consider the God they served, right? It says, and they shall see them, or for they shall wisely consider of his name. In verse 10, the righteous shall be glad in the Lord and shall trust in him, and all the upright in heart shall glory. The righteous see it and rejoice. So you see three different categories of people here, really. You see those that were openly wicked and those that were doing all the plotting and planning and trying to destroy. And the Lord steps in and he sends judgment on them. And then you almost see these spectators who they see it and they're, man, suddenly they fear God and they're thinking about God all of a sudden, right? And then you see the group that was already God's people, the righteous children of God, and they look at it and they rejoice in God's blessing. They rejoice in God's protection. They rejoice in God's answered prayer. And they glory. It says, and all the upright in heart shall glory. Now, what does that mean? I believe that last half of that verse means that they are going to praise God. They're going to glorify God. They're going to rejoice in what God has done, right? Remember, the righteous in this chapter didn't even necessarily know the arrow was pointed at them. They didn't know where the traps all laid, but God stepped in and intervened. Now they did know maybe some of it, but they didn't know all of it. And they rejoice when they see what God has done for them. Now, I'm looking at my clock, and some of you have clocks and some of you don't. And you go, hey, wow, we're already done with Psalms chapter 64. Man, we're going to get done like 20 minutes, 25 minutes early. No, sorry. That's not the plan. I told you at the beginning, right? We were going to start in Psalms chapter 64. I want to do a little exercise here with you guys. Don't worry, you won't have to speak up. I want you to think about this chapter. Now, in verse 3, it talked about the wicked that were whetting their tongue like a sword. They were preparing, they were using their words, they were sharpening their words, they were setting traps. But by the end, it says that they shall make their own tongue to fall upon themselves. And then it says that the bystanders are going to see it and consider it and think about God. I want you to sit there for a second and I want you to think about, are there any stories in the Bible that show this? Can you think of some stories in the Bible where the wicked were using their words and their plans to cause trouble for the righteous, and when it was all said and done, they actually fell in their own trap? In other words, their words came back to bite them. I saw one person shaking their head yes. What do you think? Has God shown us this example before? Has God shown us in His Word? This happens sometimes. I read a couple different commentaries. I think John Gill was the one that laid it out the most concise. He mentioned a couple, and then I've thought through a few more. How about a guy by the name of Haman and Mordecai? You remember the story in Esther? What happened in Esther? Let's just take a look real quick. We're going to give a quick summary here, just as a good reminder for everybody. We're going to start in Esther chapter 3. In verse 1 it says, after these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. Then the king's servants which were in the gates said unto Mordecai, Why transgressest thou the king's commandment? Now it came to pass, when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath, and he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. So you look at this. This guy sees somebody that's not giving him the reverence that he wants. This guy is somebody that is so full of pride that one person not giving him reverence is driving him nuts. And it's not good enough that he would take out that one person, but he literally says, I want to wipe out his family. And it's not good enough that he wants to wipe out his family. He says, I want to wipe out his people. Why? Because the guy wouldn't bow before him? So you see here what he does. And we know from the story that he kind of tricks the king into destroying these people. He says in verse 8, And Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, There's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people. Neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business to bring it unto the king's treasuries. And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, The silver is given to thee, and the people also, to do with them as it seemeth good to thee. And we know, as the story goes, he hatches this plan, and there's going to be a certain day where and it's one of the goofiest plans, it seems like, in the world, right? We let them know about it. We let them know it's coming. It's going to happen on this day, da-da-da-da-da. But he sets this plan. He's laying this. And what he's done is he's went to the king, and he's shined the Jewish people in a bad light before the king. And he's convinced the king that we just need to destroy him. It's for your profit. It's for your benefit, king, that we do this. Now, was it for the king's benefit? Was it really for the king's profit? It wasn't. Why did he do it? Because that guy wouldn't give him enough reverence. It had nothing to do with the king. Nothing to do with the king. And so he's using the king here in Esther. Now we know that in like chapter 4, that Esther is in a position where she can help, and she does some things to try to help, right? Now if you go to chapter 5, it says in verse 1, this is part of Esther's plan. Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in a royal house over against the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther, and what is thy request? It shall be given thee to half of the kingdom. And Esther answered, If it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto a banquet that I have prepared for him. Then the king said, Cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? Even to the half of the kingdom it shall be performed. Then answered Esther and said, My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do it tomorrow as the king has said. Verse 9, Then went Haman forth that day joyful and with a glad heart. Man, listen, this is a guy that's full of pride. This is a guy that's lifted up. This is a guy that's planning on going places. And the fact that the queen has specifically asked for him to come to a private banquet between him and the king. Like, man, this has just made his day. It says his heart was glad. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up, nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself, and when he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh his wife. And Haman told them of the glory of his riches and the multitude of his children, and all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he advanced him above the princes and servants of the king. Now, I have a feeling this guy had surrounded himself with people that were on his bandwagon and were just following his coattails, because how annoying would it be to be friends with this guy? Come on over to my house. Man, the king's done this for me. Look at how much money I have. Look at how much my kids are blessed. I am this, I am that, I am this. And the queen has asked me to come. This guy'd be annoying, honestly. But he lays out all those things that he's got in his favor. But in verse 12, Haman said, moreover, yea, Esther, the queen, did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared, but myself. And tomorrow am I invited unto her also with the king. Man, I got invited. And not only did I get invited, I got invited back. It's great. But, verse 12, Haman said verse 13, yet nothing, so long as Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Man, he's got all kinds of things. He's got the king's favor. The king literally let him pass a law and gave him tons of money to go get it taken care of. He's invited into the court. He's got the king's ear. He's been invited by the queen. All of these things are right up his alley, and yet he's not happy because one guy won't bow before him. Talk about a wife. Then in verse 14, then said Zeresh his wife and all his friends unto him, let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak thou unto the king, that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou in merrily with the king unto the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. Talk about presumptive, by the way. But hey, the king did everything he wanted up to this point. He said, just build a gallows. And when you go into the king, we already know the king listens to you. Just have him hung. By the way, the plot and plan is already in place to kill the people. It's almost like that's not good enough. He wants Mordecai gone now. So then, in verse 6, and on the night, talk about I don't know about you, but I imagined in my mind Haman hiding behind the hedge with his sword drawn or his bow pulled back, his traps laid. They're all out there. They're ready to be sprung at any minute. But Psalm 64 says, but God let loose his arrow. Now look at verse 1 of chapter 6. On that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for this? Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, there is nothing done for him. The night before Haman was going to ask for Mordecai to be hung, then king couldn't sleep, and he asked, like some of us do today, he asked for a book. He asked for something to be read to him. And as they're reading, he remembers, hey, there was a plot on my life, and there was this guy named Mordecai who actually is the one that uncovered it and basically kept me from being killed. What did we ever do for that guy, by the way? Oh, we didn't do anything for him. Nothing. And the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman was come into the outward court of the king's house. Why? Well, one, there was a banquet, but he had a message for the king before the banquet, right? He was going to ask for Mordecai to be put on the gallows. he came to speak unto the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's servant said unto him, Behold, Haman standeth in the court. And the king said, Let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, What shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Before Haman could even get the words out about hanging Mordecai, the king said, I have a question for you. What should we do for the guy that the king really wants to show the people that he delights in him? Now, you don't have to know much about Haman to realize that he's going to instantly think that he must be talking about me, because who is better than me? It says, Now Haman thought in his heart, To whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? And Haman answered the king, For the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let the royal apparel be brought, which the king useth to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. And let his apparel and his horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback through the streets of the city, and proclaim before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. You can almost imagine his excitement and his just the way he's anticipating this, right? He thinks he's getting to lay out his own honor. And then the axe falls. It says, Then the king said to Haman, Make haste, take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew that sitteth at the king's gate, and let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken. How many of you pictured in Psalms chapter 64 the guy that's whetting his tongue like the sword, right? And he's sharpening it, he's laying it out, he's planning it, he's got all this stuff. And yet in the end, when God lets loose his arrow, his own words come back to bite him. It says in verse 11, there's so much left out here in my mind. Like, I want to know what his facial expression was. Like, I want to know what he thought when it happened. Right? We aren't told that. We're just told that in verse 11, Then took Haman the apparel and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and brought him on horseback through the streets of the city, and proclaimed before him, Thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor. The man he hated, the man that had caused him to want to do mass murder, the man he had planned on saying, I'm going to ask the king to hang him in my own backyard because he wouldn't bow before me. Haman is now leading that man through the city with the apparel on the guy, up on the horse, and Haman is having to declare, this is what happens to people that the king delights in. It says, And Mordecai came again to the king's gate. When it was done, Mordecai went right back to where he was. He went back to the king's gate. But Haman hasted to his house, mourning and having his head covered. Man, he was ashamed. And Haman told Zeresh his wife and all his friends everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men and Zeresh his wife unto him, If Mordecai be the seed of the Jews before whom thou hast began to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him. Oh, wait a second. If the guy that you just led through the streets delights the king, and he's a Jew, and aren't you the one that plotted and planned to have all the Jews killed? This ain't going to work out well for you, Haman. Oh, by the way, these were the people that were yesterday telling him and encouraging him to go have Mordecai hung on the gallows, right? It says, And while they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains and hastened to bring Haman into the banquet that Esther had prepared. And then as you get into chapter 7, you see in verse 1, So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen, And the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to the half of the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, and I and my people to be destroyed, to be slain, to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Then King Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, Who is he, and where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? Now Haman is here with them at this banquet, and he's already down, he's already discouraged. Now, I don't know if he had began to have a little bit of hope, or maybe he's here before the king and Esther. We aren't really told. But I wonder, as she starts to talk, well, Lord, my people have been sold. Is it dawning on Haman yet? Wait a second. My people? Like, what are you a different, well, you're not, oh. Wait a second. Which people? It says in verse 6, because the king had asked who it was, the Esther said, The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. I imagine personally that as she says it, she points at him. It's him. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, and went into the palace garden. And Haman stood up to make a request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. You think? Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the palace of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed wherein Esther was. And then said the king, Will he force the queen also before him in the house? Before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. As the king spoke, they put something over Haman's head, and he is on his way to judgment. It says in Harbonah, one of the chamberlains said before the king, Behold, also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, Hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that they had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. It is such an amazing story. And when you think about it in the context of Psalms chapter 64, you imagine again all this plotting, planning, conniving, and they're sharpening their words, and they're practicing it, and they're planning it. And they're getting ready their bow and arrow. And about the time they're going to let it loose, God springs his trap. God lets loose his arrow. And the next thing you know, all of those things that they had planned and plotted and connived just turn around, and now they're the ones, right? They're the ones that are having to lead somebody else through the street. They're the ones whose their plot and plan has been uncovered. What was it they said in Psalm 64? Who's going to see it? Well, God saw it, and then God revealed it. And then Haman had to pay the price that he had planned for everybody else, down to the very gallows that he had built for somebody else. Such a great picture. That's one. Did you think of another one? Yeah. How about Daniel? I see a few people shaking their head, yeah. How about Daniel? What happened to Daniel? We don't have time to read the story, but I think you guys know it really well, right? Man, they looked for what can we hold against Daniel. But Daniel lived uprightly. Daniel tried to live wisely. And as they looked, they couldn't find anything to accuse Daniel of. But then they said, unless we can make it about his God, because he will not go against his God. And so these guys got together. Oh, what? secret council. Isn't that even the way that Psalm 64 described it? They got together in a secret council and they laid out this plan. We're going to go before the king and we're going to tell the king, we got this great idea. They're playing up to his pride. They're saying, we think you should pass this law where nobody can pray to anybody but you for 30 days. The story always cracks me up. Like, why 30 days? Like, why 30 days? If you feel this way about the king, why not just say that nobody can ever pray anything to anybody other than to you, king? 30 days. Even they wanted it to be temporary. 30 days. And anybody that breaks it, they're going to get cast into the lion's den. And when it passed, and Daniel heard that it passed, Daniel kept doing what Daniel had already been doing, and he went in and prayed to the Lord like 3 times a day. He didn't stop. He didn't hide it. He didn't start doing something he hadn't already been doing. He just kept doing what he had already been doing. And then what happened? They found him praying, right? They took him before the king. And the king had no choice, even though he didn't want to do it. He tried to find a way out of it. But the king had to throw Daniel in the lion's den. And the king, as he putting the lid on this thing, says, I know that the God you serve will deliver you. And then he stays up all night fretting and fasting and worrying about it. And then he goes down and he calls out to Daniel, and Daniel answers. Daniel's safe. Well, you know what they did? As soon as they had Daniel out, the king called for those guys that had plotted and planned to actually be thrown into the lion's den with their families. And it says that they didn't even touch the ground before the lions had started to get into them. The lions that had not touched Daniel. Again, such a great picture of Psalm chapter 64, right? Secret councils, plotting and planning, and yet in the end, their own words came back to condemn them. And when God intervened, he turned the tables on them completely. In some ways, even what happened to the Lord Jesus Christ. Hey, listen. For most of Jesus' ministry, they were plotting and planning on how they could get rid of him. They finally did accomplish it. But as we've often said, what they thought was victory was actually their defeat. Because all they did was accomplish God's plan. Jesus Christ dying on the cross had been the plan the whole time. They thought their trap had been sprung. They thought their arrow had struck true. But in reality, God just accomplished the work of redemption. Listen, God may not always move in quite as obvious a thing as he did with Esther and with Daniel. But it is the same God we serve. And on small scales and medium scales and really big scales, God does exactly what you see in Psalm chapter 64. There are times when those that have been out to seek and to cause as much trouble as they possibly could end up falling into their own trap. Their own trap. God knows what he's doing. God is in control. And the psalmist was right at the very beginning of that psalm, and we need to do it too. Go to the Lord and ask the Lord to hear your prayer. Ask the Lord to keep you from the fear of those that would take your life. Ask the Lord to keep you from the secret counsel of the wicked and from the tumultuous crowd of iniquity. Ask the Lord for help. Ask the Lord to protect you. Ask the Lord to unravel the plans of the wicked. Oftentimes we don't. Oftentimes we try to just jump in and fix it ourselves. Our best defense is not ourselves. Our best defense is God. Go to Him. As you have trials, troubles, conflicts, go to the Lord. He can deliver. All right? Brother Philip, if you would come and lead us in a song, please.